Funding for this firing line debate is made possible by a major grant from the Hatton W. Sumner's Foundation. Additional funding is provided by the Colcom Foundation and the John M. Olin Foundation.
Good evening. From the Al Hill Auditorium in the Hall of States in Dallas, Texas, welcome to a special firing line debate. For the next 2 hours, we'll be hearing 8 distinguished debaters on tonight's topic, Resolved, It is Time to Abolish the Welfare State. When Americans hear the term welfare state, they naturally think of welfare, meaning government help for the poor. But the classical meaning of welfare state is broader than that. It refers to societies where the government plays a much larger role in providing social benefits to all citizens, benefits ranging from national health care to daycare to job retraining to, free cocktails on William F. Buckley's birthday. Someone from free Sweden or France might look around the United States and say, we have no welfare state worth abolishing. Gandhi famously said once, when asked his opinion of Western civilization, I think it would be a good idea. That's one possible view about the welfare state in America. What does it mean, though, to abolish the welfare state? Does it mean that old folks who can't afford health care should just do without? Does it mean that private charity should step into the breach? Does it mean that the federal government should continue to guarantee this kind of thing, but use free market techniques like vouchers, or turn running the programs over to the states or to private agencies? I know we can count on the affirmative team tonight not to muddle these distinctions, just as we can count on the opposition team not to emote a lot about poor people going hungry and to stick to the issues. And on that note, let's welcome tonight's debaters. The captain of the affirmative team tonight is William F. Buckley, Jr., who is an inspiration to all of us who believe you can make it in America without government assistance. No government bureaucracy arranged for Mr. Buckley to be born into a wealthy family. He did that completely on his own. He attended prep school in Yale without a dime of scholarship money. He founded National Review, created Firing Line, wrote dozens of books, hundreds of articles, zillions of newspaper columns, and through it all, he never accepted so much as a single food stamp. There are times when he's been hungry. Oh yes, the chef's night off. But even then, he'd rather order a pizza than suffer the indignity of visiting a soup kitchen, because that's just the kind of guy he is. Pete DuPont is another prominent American who has made it without any help from the government. Born Pierre DuPont into a family of struggling chemical manufacturers, he soon became a congressman from Delaware and later governor of that state. In his entire Delaware political career, Pete DuPont never once exploited the fact that his family happens to own the entire state and everything and everyone in it. The DuPonts truly know the meaning of their old company slogan, better living through chemistry. Pete could have spent the rest of his life just lounging around on his governor's salary. But instead, in 1988, he ran for president. He did lose, and he was exiled to cyberspace, where he now runs an online magazine of all things called intellectualcapital.com. John Goodman is not on welfare either, but he's got the next best thing. He's head of a policy think tank. Mr. Goodman's think tank is called the National Center for Policy Analysis, and it plays a prominent role in the public policy debates on subjects like the flat tax, health care, and of course, welfare reform. And now that welfare reform is the law, Mr. Goodman is doing his bit to make it a success. This isn't very well known. The National Center for Policy Analysis has put dozens of former welfare recipients to work analyzing policy. Instead of sitting around all day shooting the breeze and drinking coffee, they put in a solid 8 hours of policy analysis. And it's a big success. Many of them say they can't tell the difference. Alan Keyes is also a former Republican presidential candidate. He ran in 1996. In the 1980s, he served as an Assistant Secretary of State, among other posts, in the Reagan administration. And he is now president of the Ronald Reagan Alumni Association. That's not a full-time job. His current job is host of the nationally syndicated radio talk show, The Alan Keyes Show, America's Wake-Up Call. President Reagan, I believe, said it was morning in America back in 1984, so that wake-up call is none too soon. In fact, it appears we've overslept for about 15 years. The captain of the opposition team is James Galbraith, who's a professor of government at the University of Texas, author of books, head of several progressive activist organizations, and a regular contributor to the American Prospect, among many other publications. His new book is called Created Unequal: The Crisis in American Pay. James Galbraith is also, as many viewers probably suspect, the son of William Buckley's old sparring partner, John Kenneth Galbraith. It apparently takes 2 generations of Galbraiths to handle 1 generation of Buckley. Laura Tyson is Dean of the Business School at the University of California-Berkeley. Or rather, to give her her full title in its full glory, she is the Bank of America Dean of the Walter Haas School of Business at the University of California-Berkeley. But she's very informal. You don't have to call her Dean Tyson or Dr. Tyson. Just call her Bank of America. Bank of America served 4 years in the Clinton administration, first as head of the Council of Economic Advisors, and then as head of the National Economic Council. She is therefore uniquely qualified to tell us what on earth is the difference, if any, between those 2 organizations. Robert Kuttner is a frequent participant in these debates. He's editor of the American Prospect, which is probably the leading left-wing journal of ideas in this country. And he is also a columnist for Business Week, which is many things, but not a left-wing journal of ideas. He is the author of more books than most people, though less than Mr. Buckley. And his most recent book is called Everything for Sale: The Virtues and Limits of Markets. And William Curry, the last panelist in the opposition team, is a longtime Democratic politician and political advisor. He was elected to the Connecticut State Senate in 1978 at the age of 26, and he served 2 terms. Flash forward a couple of decades, and he was a counselor to President Clinton. He's currently writing a book about the Clinton presidency, like some other people. My name is Mike Kinsley. I'm the moderator. My full-time job is editor of an online magazine called Slate.com, and I now call on Mr. Buckley to propose tonight's motion.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, we tend to date the modern welfare state to 1965 with the Great Society policies of President Lyndon Johnson. In constant dollars, we have spent the $5 trillion on welfare, yet the percentage of the American people technically below the poverty line is about the same. In identical constant dollars, we fought the Second World War at a cost of $3 trillion. The haunting indictment of our experiences with the welfare state is that a more human welfare could be achieved without it, and B, it has in fact helped to corrode the great aspirations of our country. It has done this to begin with by helping to create an underclass. Granted that the poverty figures belie actual conditions, 41% of those in quotes poverty own their own homes and cars. Indeed, the traditional hallmarks of poverty, which are exposure to hunger and hopelessness, to a lack of medicine and education and health care, or in the language of policy analyst Robert Rechter, simply, quote, ended in round economic numbers. What has undeniably increased is the character of the dispossessed class. The great dispossessed class in America today is single parent and no parent children. Before the ideologization of the welfare state, they were 1 in 20 American births. Now they are 1 in 3. These children have a 600% higher chance to live in poverty, suffer from disease, spend time in prison than their brothers and sisters living with fathers and mothers. The primary entitlement achieved by the biological parents of this class during this period is sexual freedom. They got that and bred true misery. The polls established that the beneficiaries of state welfare aid themselves concede that welfare aid encouraged their irresponsibility. The greatest measure of extra biological misery in modern America is spiritual emptiness, loneliness, the failure to know just where that happiness lies, in the pursuit of which we were enjoined by the Declaration of Independence. With the Welfare Reform Act of 1996, vital signs of recovery began to appear on the economic stage. Welfare recipients dropped sharply in Wyoming by 72%, in New York City from 1 million to 700,000. The 40% rise in the cost of public education has brought an almost corresponding rise in relative illiteracy. We need then vital reforms in education. We need vital reforms in healthcare costs, towards which 1/2 of our annual $400 billion of welfare expenses go. We need to abandon, Mr. Chairman, the idea of the welfare state as an automatic conveyor belt, Congress to the taxpayers to welfare recipients. There are different approaches to the challenge of freeing ourselves from the burdens and the consequences of the welfare state. Charles Murray has a direct approach: simply phase it out. My distinguished colleagues tonight have their own approaches. That of Dr. John Goodman of the National Center for Policy Analysis here in Dallas is the most explicitly formulated. A design to give to the taxpayers a direct hand in the direction he desires and she intends to convey their contributions to welfare. The details of the proposal will be revealed to you, leaving me with the excitement of revealing only a basic hint of it, which is that a taxpayer would decide for himself who and what are the most appealing beneficiaries of his charity. To argue the impossible, a genetic attribute, would you, Mr. Chairman, turn the floor over to Professor James Galbraith?
Professor Galbraith. Professor Galbraith will oppose the motion.
My friend Bill Buckley, who was once a conservative, tonight plays the role of the radical, the abolitionist, the William Lloyd Garrison of the welfare state. What would he abolish? Not poverty, not insecurity, not the fear of facing illness without the means to pay for doctors, not the penury of a penniless old age. No. He would abolish precisely those institutions that protect Americans from those evils and that have done so with success for 60 years. Let me share a secret. The mixed economy works. Our American economy has a public and a private sector. My radical friends love to love the private and love to hate the public. But in truth, we need them both. Let us open that black box, which the resolution so intemperately calls the welfare state. Of what exactly does it consist? First, the Social Security system. A bulwark against poverty in old age, Social Security is efficient, fair, and vital. And despite the claims of its historic enemies, it is not bankrupt, it is not in crisis. Second, Medicare and Medicaid. Does anyone seriously think that without these programs, the elderly and the poor would receive better medical care than they do today? Or perhaps that they would not get sick? We know the answer. Before Medicare and Medicaid, millions of old and impoverished people had no access to health care. Third, public education. My children are in public schools. I know the problems of the system, but I'm also proud of my kids, of their teachers, and of the parents and communities that support them. Public education plays a role that private education, however valuable it may be, cannot replace. And we, on this side, want public education strengthened, not undermined, weakened, voucherized, or done away with. Finally, there is a most important role for the state: to assure full employment and decent wages for all Americans who seek to work. Another secret: we can do this with our pension and our health and our education systems intact. We are doing it now, with low interest rates, with a higher minimum wage that should be raised again, and with the brilliant, subtle policy of the Earned Income Tax Credit that since 1984 alone has grown to help over 15 million working Americans with nearly $30 billion in support each year. These are great accomplishments. They show that the public sector in America can do the job that Americans want done and that markets alone will not do. Our challenge today is to strengthen and improve these public functions, to extend access to health insurance, to maintain full employment. Abolishing the public role in our mixed economy should be the furthest thing from our minds.
Thank you, Professor Galbraith. Mr. Kuttner, Mr. Goodman. And Mr. Goodman, you can make an opening statement.
Well, I thought that list of programs was very interesting, Jamie, but those are not primarily the programs we propose to abolish. Instead, what we propose to abolish are $368 billion of spending every year on 330 different anti-poverty programs, an amount equal to about $10,000 for every poor person in America, or $40,000 for a family of four. And one of the reasons we propose to abolish it is because despite all of this spending, even in our nation's capital, you have homeless people living in cardboard boxes on the street. Clearly, something is not working. Since 1965, we spent $5.4 trillion on the welfare state, and what have we gotten in return for it? Well, according to the Council of Economic Advisors a few years ago, not very much. They estimated that had there never been a war on poverty, that the poverty rate today would be about where it is right now. What if we had taken all that money and put it in the bank instead? Well, it would have grown with interest, and today it would have accumulated to about $250,000 for every poor person in America, or $1 million for a family of four. We strikingly must realize that that poor person out there living in the cardboard box could have been a millionaire today if only we had saved, instead of turning all this money over to the welfare state bureaucrats. Now, the United Way in most cities allows givers to designate where their monies go, to which charities. The federal government does the same thing for federal employees. We are proposing to do that for taxpayers. If it's good enough for the United Way, if it's good enough for federal employees, it's good enough for the taxpayer in this country.
Thank you. Mr. Kuttner.
Unfortunately, John, the title of this debate is Resolved It's Time to Abolish the Welfare State, not Resolved It's Time to Privatize Anti-Poverty Programs. And I think most people who use the term welfare state appreciate that it refers to the big ticket items: social insurance, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, public education. In fact, programs that are explicitly targeted to the poor are less than 20% of the welfare state. So I want to take my minute here and defend Social Security, defend Medicare, and defend public education, because those are indeed the big ticket items of the welfare state. If we did not have Social Security, 42% of people over age 65 would be poor. If we did not have Medicare, as we did not have before 1965, old people, no matter how much money they had to spend, could not afford to buy health insurance because nobody wanted to sell it to them. If we did not have public education, half of the next generation would grow up illiterate because their parents couldn't afford the fees to send them to private school. These are the big ticket items of the welfare state. The vast majority of Americans agree that they're a good idea. Now, we can have a narrower gauge argument, as Congress did in 1996, about which aspect of explicitly anti-poverty programs reward behavior that none of us approves. That's a much narrower debate. But that's not the debate that your side proposed. Your side proposed that it's time to abolish the welfare state. And most Americans, I think, believe with us that that's a preposterous proposition. Thank you.
Don't leave. Mr. Goodman. Question, Mr. Kuttner.
Bob, you may know that over the last 5 years, the Clinton administration even boasts that 6 million Americans have been thrown off the welfare rolls, claiming some credit for it. A 41% reduction in number of people on welfare. 2 of your colleagues on your side tonight applaud that change, but the chairman of your team, Professor Galbraith, called this a savage law. And my question to you is, are you tonight on the side of savagery, or would you rather add 6 million people back to the welfare rolls?
Well, for one thing, a lot of the people have come off the welfare rolls because Alan Greenspan finally saw the light and realized that you could have something close to full employment without kindling inflation, and finally took his foot off the brake and let the economy grow. It would be much harder to shrink the welfare rolls if we had the kind of monetary policies that we had a decade ago. I think the 1996 Welfare Reform Act overdid it. I agree with your side and with most of my side, and I suspect even Jamie, that the old Aid to Families with Dependent Children program was a misconceived program. But if we are going to remove that kind of support, we ought to be giving people child care and health insurance and job training so that going off welfare doesn't just make them poorer, but really creates opportunity ladders rather than just penury.
Let me ask you this. Although the average state has reduced its welfare rolls by 41%, as Bill Buckley said, some states have reduced their welfare rolls by as much as 80%. But when we look at states like California and Rhode Island and the District of Columbia, virtually nothing has been done. As a matter of fact, in Hawaii, the welfare rolls over the last 5 years have actually increased by 39%. Now, why should American taxpayers fork over their hard-earned dollars to support the welfare state in Hawaii?
Well, the last time I looked, John, Hawaii was actually part of America. And a lot of what's going on in Hawaii has to do with the near collapse of the Asian economies, which Hawaii serves as a bridge in trade and other economic relations with. So that much of what's going on in Hawaii has to do with the collapse of the sugar economy and the collapse of the Asian trade. It has very, very little to do with bad policies promulgated by the government in Honolulu.
Last time I looked, Hawaii's welfare rolls were increasing long before they had those problems. But let me ask you, Bob. Let me ask you this. Americans are very generous people. They gave away $143 billion last year. But have you ever heard of anyone giving money to the food stamp program?
I'm not sure I understand the question. The American taxpayers
They're very generous people. They give to all kinds of programs to help poor people. I'm asking, have you ever heard of anyone giving to the food stamp program?
Yeah, American taxpayers and their representatives in Congress support the food stamp program.
I mean voluntary gifts.
No, you wouldn't voluntarily give something that was a tax-supported program, obviously.
Yeah, well, but they do accept gifts. I mean, if someone's willing to give to AFDC or food stamps or other entitlement programs, they will accept them. These are simply not programs that Americans choose to support when they have control over the money, right?
Well, the last time I checked, this was a representative democracy, and our representatives in Congress have enacted the food stamp program. Most experts think it's a fairly efficient way of helping the very neediest.
What I'm asking you, Bob, is why not allow people to make decisions on their own about what programs work and what programs don't work?
In other words, you want a kind of plebiscitary welfare state, where instead of having Medicare, Social Security, food stamps, and public education, you would rely on a kind of super individual charity to support all these public goods.
I'm talking about means-tested programs for the poor. What's wrong with allowing taxpayers to decide where those dollars go instead of having politicians make those decisions?
Well, suppose taxpayers decide that medical care for the aged or for the indigent is not a fashionable cause this year. Do we let people die on the street?
No one's proposing that. But suppose taxpayers decide there are programs that aren't working and other programs that do. What's wrong with allowing taxpayers to channel money into programs that have a greater chance of success?
Well, what would you do if it became unfashionable for taxpayers to support Medicaid for the poor?
Well, I would have government as a last resort.
You would?
I don't have an objection to that.
So we're just arguing about the details.
Well, we're arguing about huge details. We're arguing about huge amounts of money being spent and not achieving anything. The real safety net in this country, Bob, is run by the private sector. When people get in trouble, If you were in a city and you lost your wallet, you needed a meal, you needed a place to stay, you turn to a private sector agency. 80% of the people turn to the private sector first. It's the private sector that's supplying the safety net. Why not allow taxpayers to subsidize that safety net directly?
I'll tell you why
instead of-
not, because you're eating
Start
into
answering
my
asking
my 5
questions.
minutes. I think the reason is that charity is fine. It has a big place, but it doesn't substitute for things like public education and medical care and basic social insurance. So let me ask you a couple of questions. What percentage of personal income goes to charitable contributions in this country?
I don't know.
You don't know?
It's not large.
I'm
I told
amazed
you the
that you don't
total
know.
number of dollars. It's about $143 billion last
Yeah.
year.
Well, it's fluctuated between, I looked this up before the debate, actually. I thought I'd prepare myself. It's fluctuated between 1.7 and 2.1% of personal income, all during the Reagan period.
Is that $143 billion?
About. All during the Reagan period, when the idea was that if you got government out of the way, private charity would make up the difference. It didn't move. It fluctuated in this same narrow range. Let me ask you another question.
Well, just to reply to that, though, we're not proposing to rely on voluntary contributions. What we're saying is that right now taxpayers are forking over $368 billion every year, and politicians are doling it out in various poverty programs. We're saying, why not let taxpayers on their own decide where those dollars go?
Let me ask you, what big programs are you counting in that $368 billion? What are the two biggest programs?
All means-tested spending.
So Medicaid.
Yes.
Medicaid.
including yes.
Okay. How would private charity substitute for Medicaid under your program?
Well, from what I can tell, and you should know this because you know something about healthcare markets, Medicaid is about the most wasteful healthcare program out there. And the private sector could easily improve on Medicaid.
And what?
It's the most fraud-ridden of all the healthcare programs in the country.
Medicaid.
Yes,
Well, what's
Medicaid.
your basis for that?
Well,
Where'd you get that?
Just pick up any newspaper.
Well, most newspapers I read are talking about
The headline
frauds
is
in-
fraud in Medicaid again.
Well, it's fraud in private HMOs. It's fraud in for-profit. It's fraud in for-profit shareholder-owned hospital chains. I think Medicaid does rather well, and Medicaid spends less money on each recipient than the middle class gets or the old folks get under Medicare in very, very trying conditions with very difficult populations. But what guarantee do you have that people, based on voluntary charity, are going to come up with enough money to provide health care for people who can't afford to pay for it out of pocket?
I'm not recommending voluntary charity. What I'm saying is instead of paying tax dollars to politicians and allowing politicians to dump those tax dollars into entitlement programs that aren't working, why not allow taxpayers to make their own decisions about where the money goes? And I wouldn't do it overnight. I would phase it in, and I would allow people first to allocate 5% of their income and then 10%, and gradually give the person who earns the dollars greater control over where they go.
You've made that clear. I think it's my turn to ask questions. And the question I'm trying to get you to answer is, what would you do if the outcome of your approach did not produce enough health care for poor people? Would you just let them die on the street?
The total number of dollars given would not change. Okay? If it turns out that there's too little for health care and too much for something else, then I
Yes.
would retain the government's role as the spender of last resort. Government fills in niches where there's obvious problems that people are not solving on their own.
This isn't a niche. This is a chasm. I mean, this is a program that spends $50 or $60 billion. It's the biggest single item in your $368 billion. So let me see if I understand what you're saying. You're saying that this is presumably a tax credit program, right? I reduce my income tax dollar for dollar up to a certain limit for every charitable contribution I make. And suppose that everybody's pet charities don't include medical care for the poor. You're saying government makes up the difference. So you're still conceding the need for a residual safety net that would be supported by taxpayers.
What I'm saying is all the money must go to poor people, okay? The tax credits can only be taken by contributions to charitable organizations that are serving poor people. Now,
But
if
you
there's
haven't
some
answered
need that isn't being met, then government is there as a spender of last resort. But I'm saying let's begin to transfer decisions from the public sector to the private sector, where people have proven time and time again that they make better decisions when it comes to relief of
It
poverty.
sounds to me like you've got a duplicative system here where you're letting people with dollars that would otherwise go to the U.S. Treasury vote for so-called voluntary charitable contributions, and then if they don't vote for needs that turn out to be dire, then the government has to make up the
I'm
difference
saying
anyway.
let's take
How is that
dollars out of
efficient?
programs that don't work and put them into programs that do work.
All right, thank you, gentlemen.
Yeah.
Governor DuPont. Governor DuPont will make an opening statement and then submit to questioning from the opposition team.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. The problem with being the fifth person in the debate is that the first four people have already messed it up beyond recognition. Let me try to bring it back. Let me try to bring it back to where it belongs. This debate is about how to best help the poor and the needy. It's not about how much help. It's about how the help is delivered. Through the federal government in Washington with its 339 means-tested welfare programs, or through charities in your own community. Specifically, should you as an individual be allowed to choose whether your share of the anti-poverty effort, which all of us want to keep funded, at least in the amount that it's now funded in, should you be able to choose to route that funding to Washington if you think it does the best in helping the poor, or to charities in your county, city, or town if you think they do a better job in helping the poor? That's not an option that you have today. We think you ought to have the choice of working through charities, since they help the poor and the needy much more effectively than Washington does. Charities like the Salvation Army, Habitat for Humanity, the Red Cross do a better job of helping. And their impact is much greater, since 2/3 of the spending on federal welfare programs ends up in the pockets of people who are not poor, of administrators, of supervisors, and of middle-class people. Charities would do a better job and ought to be given the opportunity to do so.
Mr. Kuttner.
Gentlemen.
Governor, do you happen to know what percentage of the Social Security program is spent on administration, and how that compares with private insurance programs?
I don't know the answer to that, but I don't think that is the relevant question, because Social Security isn't in this debate.
Well, wait a minute. You can't have it both ways. Well, first of all, the figure's 1% compared to about 14% for Social Security's private competitors. And you said one of the problems is that 2/3 of the money goes to people who aren't poor. Well, you must be referring to Social Security in that figure, because there's no other comparable program that's that large that could possibly justify that kind of a statistical claim.
Oh, of course there are. And Social Security is a perfect example. It's not a welfare program. You may think it's a welfare program.
It's a welfare state
I think it's a savings program, and I think it's worked well for a lot of older Americans.
Well, how can you possibly claim that 2/3 of the money
Because
targeted for the poor goes to the non-poor?
If you look at the actual monies that go in a public housing program, in a low-income heating program, to pick two examples, by the time Washington has taken its bite, the supervisors, the administrators have taken their bite, the money that actually goes to people who are poor is a very small percentage of the program.
Well,
Clearly not in Social Security, and that
Governor,
makes my
pardon the
point.
members of our team, if some of us were to cynically suspect that your definition of the welfare state just excluded all middle-class welfare and left only welfare for the poor, it was a question for some of us actually coming into this round as to just what exactly different people's definition of the welfare state might be. In fact, Mr. Goodman's numbers included lots of programs that go to the middle class, and well, he thinks not, but they did. And
So is there a question in here somewhere, Bill?
The question is this: for all of the poor elderly who depend on Social Security, on Medicare, on half the Medicaid programs, for those programs that comprise easily among them about 40% of the federal budget, your side says that this debate proposes no changes?
That's my belief.
Uh-huh.
We're
Let me follow up on that, Governor. But isn't it a fact that you do favor a program of private savings accounts, individual savings accounts, as a partial replacement for the present Social Security system.
Indeed, I do.
Then why aren't you prepared to defend that proposal as part of the part of the
Absolutely,
debate
I'm
here
prepared to
tonight?
defend it. In fact, the Social Security program to all these young people out there is going to be less likely than a UFO. You've heard that statistic.
Splendid.
There
Then let's
aren't going
put
to
Social
be any
Security
checks.
firmly on the table, and we can now proceed to discuss whether the claim you're making is correct.
But Professor, I hope you're not teaching your students that Social Security is a welfare program for the poor, because they will come out of your college woefully unprepared for the real world. It is a savings program. It is a savings program for every American, wealthy, middle class, and poor, and it is manifestly not part of this debate.
Well, in fact, it's not a savings program. It's an income transfer program. I think everybody else in America acknowledges that Social Security does not produce net savings. That's not the point of the program. The point of the program is that the payroll taxes from working people support retired people. So, in fact, it's not a savings program. I want to come back to this $368 billion because I can't imagine how you got it without including a lot of middle-class programs. Aid to Families with Dependent Children and its successor program, TANF, and housing programs and other programs explicitly targeted to the poor add up to well under $100 billion. Where did you come up with this figure?
Well, to the extent, I didn't come up with $339 billion. I don't know where that came from. I came up with 339 means-tested
That fellow sitting to your right.
And when John gets back up here, we can do the arithmetic. But I'm excluding from this debate the programs that are helping the middle class. That's not the subject tonight. The question is, how are we best going to help someone who needs to eat? And the answer is a Salvation Army soup kitchen. And we ought to let the taxpayers decide that they would rather give to the soup kitchen in Wilmington, Delaware, than they would send the money to Washington and have it route through the bureaucracy and come back.
And you really think that having people line up for soup kitchens is preferable to letting them have food stamps where they can go to the supermarket with a modicum of dignity and put food on the table for their children? You'd really rather have them line up at the Salvation Army? Is that what you're arguing?
No, I'm not arguing that.
What are you arguing?
40% of the families receiving public housing vouchers, for example, are not poor. 40% of the poor families in the country don't even receive food stamps. They don't get any benefit from the government. I'm saying that soup kitchens provide poor people with food. They're a good thing.
So do food stamps.
Whether there,
we'll find out.
Whether
Thank
there
you
we'll
very
find
much,
out when I
Governor.
speak again.
Dr. Tyson.
Well, clearly we do have a little disagreement tonight about what the welfare state means. And I'm afraid if Pete DuPont thinks I'm misleading my students, then most textbooks...
No, that was Professor Galbraith.
Yes, but I also teach, and I can assure you that if you open almost any introductory textbook on economics, and I don't care if it's from the right wing or the left wing, from the right side or the left side, the definition of a welfare state is broad enough to include any social insurance program which essentially exists to protect individuals, regardless of income, against unforeseen contingencies. And those are the primary aspects of the welfare state in the United States. The big money in the United States is spent on Social Security and Medicare, and those programs primarily go to the middle class. Now, because I accept that definition, I think that is the only sensible definition for this debate. Therefore, I'm going to talk a little bit about health, because I think that is a very important part of the welfare state in the United States. Why is it appropriate for the government to be involved in the healthcare system? 3 reasons: ethics, economics, and politics. The ethics are the dignity and value of human life. We give value to human life. We give dignity to human life. We wish to protect human life. We wish to protect individuals from unforeseen misfortunes. We do that through a social insurance system. Secondly, economics. The health insurance system it does not work in the private system very well. Just ask yourself the following question. If you were an insurer, would you want to insure a sick person? No. You want to find people who aren't going to be sick, and you insure them. That way you make a lot of money, and you don't actually have to provide any insurance. It was very difficult for the elderly to get any health insurance before Medicare. More than half of the Americans who were elderly did not have health insurance. A lot because they couldn't afford it, but a lot because they couldn't get the policies. So we have an ethics reason, we have an economics reason, not to mention the fact that my well-being as a citizen is affected by the health of the people around me. I care about whether the people around me are vaccinated. I care about whether the people around me, if they are sick, are going to get treated so that I don't get sick as well. So there are economic reasons, and finally there are political reasons for having a healthcare system as part of our social welfare state. After all, if you ask Americans what they value most, they will say the right to decent health care for each and every American.
Thank you. Don't leave. Mr. Keyes.
Well, I actually want to ask a question that doesn't really go to the details of what we're talking about yet, but still intrigues me kind of. And I'm asking it because I want to hear you state the answer. Okay. Because we need it.
If I know the answer.
We need it on the table. Oh, you have to know the answer. Mm-hmm. And it's actually a very simple question. The welfare state, as I understand it, leave aside all these other details y'all are talking about, actually means the use of government coercion to force people to help one another. That's what it is about. and what I would like to hear you address, is the simple question: why is it morally right to use government power to help people, to force people, to coerce people into helping one another? Why is it morally justifiable to do so?
We live in a representative democracy. Where did our social welfare arrangements come from? They came from the voters. As we moved, if you look across our society and across other societies, as we moved towards universal suffrage, as we moved to women voting, more and more people voted in favor of government intervention for social welfare programs. This is a representative democratic choice. It is not a coercion choice. If the American people want to vote out Medicare, I would like to see the votes. There are no votes like that. You know what the American people want to do right now? They want to vote in limitations on HMOs. That's what they want to do. They want a Bill of Rights for HMOs. That is coercion by your definition.
One simple follow-up. Simple question. In the 19th century, the majority of people in this country voted in various ways to support the system of slavery. The labor of one group was coercively used by another for its benefit and welfare. Are you saying that it is morally right for majorities to enslave others and force them to do the majority's will?
I think if a representative democracy has laws that codify and allow slavery, then I would not want to be part of that representative democracy. I'm talking about the American representative democracy right now. It is not slavery.
Well,
it is a choice of the American people. And really, it seems to me that you actually do an insult to the term slavery by using it in this context.
Dr. Goodman, it is slavery.
The $368 billion number comes from the Congressional Research Service, and it's about 2/3 federal and 1/3 state, and it's all means-tested spending. It's the most recent annual number, and it does come out to more than $10,000 per person. And what I want to ask you is this. I mean, here is a paper that I picked up this morning talking about people homeless in cities all over the country. How can we spend more than $10,000 for every poor person, $40,000 for a family of four, and still have people sleeping in cardboard boxes? How's that possible?
Well, I would say two things to this. Number one of the things that has happened here, which none of you have mentioned, is that because of changes in technology, because of changes in global competition, because of much bigger economic forces than the $383 billion you're talking about, the distribution of income in the United States has become increasingly unequal. The bottom 40% have basically been losing share over the last 30 years. They've been losing absolutely over the last 25 years. So the situation is a lot harder to deal with. Number one. Number two, I would only say look at other societies who are as affluent as we are, who spend more and better dollars on health and on homeless and don't have the homeless problem we have. We have the homeless problem. Perhaps we're not spending enough.
Hasn't that income gap?
Oh, well, I can... That's fine. I don't think that this has been demonstrated at all, that we are spending too much.
Can you explain to me why?
As a share of gross national product, as a share of the federal budget, as a share of national income, The amount we spend on homeless programs has been declining for the last 25 years, while the problem has been getting worse.
Can you explain to me why the income gap has widened faster in the Clinton administration than in the Reagan administration?
Well, I could only say that it was the Clinton administration that put into effect the largest expansion of the earned income tax credit that the nation has seen, and as a consequence of that, you've heard that we've eliminated 15 million families off of the poverty roll. You talk about the $383 billion. I hope you're including the earned income tax credit in there.
Thank you both, Mr. Curry and Mr. Keyes. Mr. Keyes. Mr. Keyes will make an opening statement.
As has just been illustrated, I think that for me, the core question here has less to do with all the details that are being discussed than with the fundamental question of whether it is right to coerce people to do good. The proper concept of government, I believe, is government exists to constrain people from doing bad things to one another. The very meaning of the term welfare carries the role of government into the area where you are to force people to do good. Some people say that that is compassion, that it is compatible with the moral concepts of helping and compassion that grew out of Christian civilization. They are wrong, because the essence of charity, caritas, as the word implies, is grace. And God himself does not force us to accept his grace. The word caritas in Greek meant grace, and charity were the works that resulted from the acceptance of God's grace and the willingness to manifest that grace to others. At the root of charity was one's self-determination with respect to that relationship to God. What we have established instead of that system of charity is an immoral system in which the government does what God does not, forces us to do good. And by forcing us to do good, puts us in the position where we are destroying our own moral capacity to make the choice to do good and giving others the false understanding that they have an entitlement that in fact precludes gratitude, that in fact therefore involves them in the sinful rejection of the opportunity to acknowledge God's will and grace. It is therefore in the final analysis the establishment of a state religion in which we are forced to tithe in order to support what the state regards as charitable works. This is a destruction of conscience.
Thank you. Mr. Curry.
First of all, this Connecticut Yankee would like to say how nice it is to be in Texas. And greetings to all. I want to go through as many of these concepts as I can in the few seconds that I have. Just one, to use terms like state religion and slavery is an assault on the English language and on reason, and it's wrong. It's just wrong. And everybody who cheered, I include in this, everybody should just chill out a little here and see if we can get to a little closer sense of what perhaps a reasonable truth might be. Everything the government does can be described as a coercion in the way that Mr. Keyes chooses to. The defense budget, public schools, Social Security, which apparently the team, except for Mr. Keyes, is for. Every last penny of it is a form of coercion. And the theory that we all studied in school, in all 50 states, is that there would be equal opportunity under constitutional law, a franchise. We would be a Republican form of government. As a Democrat, it's hard to get that out, but a Republican form of government. Representative governments would meet in legislative bodies and make decisions, and that so long as they were within the Constitution is the sovereign. The Constitution is the sovereign, not the president, not the Congress. The Constitution in this case says that enough people to change it, 2/3 of the American people and I'm now going to forget the process, but 3/4 of the states, majority votes, and 2/3 of the Congress, that changes, that's what it takes to change the law. There are no restraints on what that person can do. But within that system, that's what we have. We have a representative democracy. Now let me just say a couple of things about the issue at hand.
Why don't we let the questioning do that, Mr. Keyes?
You've made the statement that it's an abuse of the language to call welfare slavery, but if I force someone to take their labor and use it according to my will, is that freedom or slavery?
Yeah, let me just say two things. First of all, for all of the millions of immigrants, for all of the millions of African Americans and Irish Americans who came to this country and worked and couldn't say how much they'd get, they worked for $1 a day. They worked to live in hovels. They worked to get a little bit of a hand up, not a hand out. And there was coercion in every bit of it. Not just the government coerces, large bureaucracies coerce. One of the things that this team has to learn, I think, is that there are problems on both sides. The cost of paperwork in the private sector healthcare system is 20%, which is 3 to 4 times what it is in the public healthcare. And the amount of coercion in the private workplace is every bit as big as when the tax collector comes in.
But
for people,
no, excuse me.
No, guys, open up. For people who have no power, that's why you have a minimum wage.
But now we are
That's why
closer.
you have a minimum wage. Some people.
Excuse me.
Yeah. Gee whiz, but I'd hate to break the tradition that's been set so far.
He gets to answer the questions, I think. He gets to answer the questions. But in this particular case, of course, he exercised the right to answer the question in order not to answer it. Since the answer to the question is, of course, that the use of coercion in this regard is slavery, but that you believe that in this instance, for the sake of the gold... Let me finish.
No, I'm going to let you take some question time to even say.
I think it's very, very simple. My ancestors were forced to do work. Other people then took the fruits of that work and did with it as they pleased. They probably did some works of charity. They even went so far, they even went so far as to build homes and to take care of my ancestors. There was this one little problem. My ancestors did the work, but they didn't decide to do what to do with the fruits of the labor.
I think I'm ready.
And they were coerced to do so. Now, I would like to get a clear answer to the question. You say that coercion is justified.
So you're saying the
here.
taxpayers
Why?
are the slaves in this?
Why?
Is that what you're saying? When you say this welfare system is slavery, I'm just trying to follow your line of thinking. You're saying that the taxpayers are the slaves. Is that right?
Those who are forced, yes, to pay money for these purposes coercively
are the taxpayers who pay for the defense budget slaves?
No.
Okay. Are the taxpayers who pay for public education slaves?
No.
Is it just programs for the poor and the vulnerable and the disadvantaged that enslave people?
Actually, it includes all forms. It includes all forms of this kind of welfare spending for corporations and others, which are aimed at substituting for those. Let me finish. You asked a question. Can I finish? Because contrary to your view of the Constitution, but as outlined in the Constitution is a clear set of limitations. A point of privilege, you asked the question.
Go ahead.
Clear set of limitations on what government coercion can be used to accomplish. One of the things it can't be used to accomplish is the establishment of a state religion and the interference with the free exercise of religion. And what you define as works of charity, as works of caritas, as works of grace, those things which take the mercy works that we do and aim them at caring for the body to the exclusion of the works of salvation. That is a godless understanding of charity which you impose using state power.
No one's.
And that godless
it's a ludicrous. Excuse me. First of all, I will try to restrain how deeply offended I am that for the sake of some paltry public debate, you've just accused me of godlessness. We just met 10 minutes ago. Number two.
You're known by the company you keep.
The foolish intellectual. That's just such a rude and mean-spirited thing to say. No wonder you have these views. Number two. No one's mandating charity. That's the point. I can't believe you actually missed this. People are mandating the transfer of income payments because they've decided that we're better off if, in fact, people have the basic sustenance to live. It's a decision you disagree with. It's a representative democracy. The decision has been repeated again and again.
I don't know what you.
But no one's requiring charity of you.
That's not true.
We don't care how you feel about it.
I don't.
Any more than you care about how I feel about it.
The word
excuse me.
charity.
Now, come on. Let's
Now
be
you
fair.
took the floor.
In the end,
the word charity.
I took the floor, so you get to speak.
The word charity, contrary to what you seem to believe, actually had to do with those works of mercy.
I don't know what it had to do, but we all know the plain meaning of it
had to do with those works of mercy.
Let me help you with what it means.
All the works of mercy you described: caring for the sick, caring for the elderly, caring for the poor, caring for one's elderly parents. All these things fell under the rubric of charity, which you have usurped with these government programs.
When we have deadbeat dads who don't send money to their children,
and leave them alone. Fathers, you talk about people giving anonymous charitable contributions to take care of the poor. We have millions of fathers that don't support their own children when they have the money to in this country. And the fact of the matter
by the welfare state mentality
everything's
that
fault
you
of
and your
government.
colleagues
I've met some of them, and some of them are just plain irresponsible. Some of them just aren't loving. It's not just the government that's bad in this life, Mr. Keyes. And so the government steps in, and the government makes sure that when a child's been abandoned by a parent, that child has
when a child has been abandoned by a parent because of the regulations and requirements of a welfare system which drove fathers out of the home, you then come around and tell me that the problem you created should now be solved with the coercion you
tiny
propose.
percentage of those deadbeat dads had anything to do with welfare. These are middle-class working men who abandon their families and their children, and because we have a government that coerces people like you who otherwise wouldn't have the moral wherewithal and the heart to do it, we have a government that coerces people to make sure there's enough money so those kids don't starve. It's a good thing.
That is also...
It's a good thing.
Can I ask a question? Since I was supposed to ask a question.
I guess we both confused that a little bit. Yeah.
No, it's your turn to ask a question. Go ahead. It's your turn to ask.
First of all, I can see.
It's my turn.
First of all, I can see how you'd be confused. Let me ask you this: in all of the programs you've described, I just want to ask you about a couple of other things that affect the poor. The earned income tax credit, which is the largest part of that, the two largest vehicles of the amount of money we're spending on social services are Social Security and the EITC, and they're having the largest impact, certainly, in terms of moving the people out of poverty in the middle class. Are you for the earned income tax credit?
Well, actually, I can't be for the earned income tax credit. I mean, I'm for, at the moment, let me explain myself, keeping it in place.
All ears.
But I don't know how we would have the earned income tax credit after we had abolished the income tax, which I believe we should do.
But let's say now. But again, in order to try to really talk to each other rather than just have a rhetorical game, if we do have the income tax, let's say next year we get up and there's still an income tax. Are you for the earned income tax credit? Are you for the earned income tax credit in this system, or aren't you?
Let's say that the fact that you ask me whether or not, since we are being burned, I am in favor of applying burn ointment, and I say yes, but it would be better to douse the fire.
Do you support a minimum wage? Did you support the increase in the earned income tax credit in 1993?
I did not support the increase, and I do not support the increases in the minimum wage that have been passed in recent years.
So you're against the minimum wage, and you're against the earned income tax credit.
I actually believe that. No.
You're against 2/3
Are you supposed to make statements or ask questions?
Well,
I'm trying to clarify your answers, Alan. That's fair.
So you should ask a question. Because you introduced now the minimum wage, which hasn't been asked.
You know, in a courtroom, you can lead the witness if he's hostile.
No, but the question is, you're not leading the witness to a question.
All right, let's not argue about what we're
Why don't you
arguing
just tell me
about.
what you think?
Think of what?
The minimum wage.
Minimum wage. You're against it?
Well, see, the sad truth is that what the minimum wage actually has done is to destroy jobs for the poor.
So you.
Why it is a good thing that we should establish a system, the end result of which is to destroy the economic prospects of the poor. And by the way, not only destroy their, you asked a question, right?
No,
not only destroy,
that doesn't mean you can have
not
the
only
theater,
destroy
Alan.
their economic prospects.
Alan, I feel you've
Laura
answered the
Tyson
question.
held on at great length when she gave her responses. You're interrupting me at the end of every sentence. That's not right.
All right.
Now, let me answer the question. The minimum wage destroys jobs. The minimum wage also, by the way, has helped to contribute to the moral pauperization of the poor. Since by destroying some of those service jobs, particularly the service jobs in homes and elsewhere that brought the poor together with others of the middle class and so forth, they have destroyed one of the very important elements of cross-fertilization that helped to maintain social cohesion in the society.
Sounds like
So in all of these ways, I think it's a bad idea.
Alan, you know, Alan, in this Christmas season, I can't help but think of Dickens. I would ask you, in fact, what Charles Dickens satirized was the notion that poverty is fundamentally the result of the ill character of the poor. And from Mr. Buckley's opening remarks to some of yours just now, do you recognize that poverty is often the result of social forces that are beyond the control of the individual?
I believe
Stop.
that
Stop.
I believe that most of the poverty in this country in the last 20 and 30 years, especially in the ruthlessly destructive character of poverty to family life and moral responsibility, is not the result of the ill character of the poor. It is the result of the ill character of government programs based upon immoral premises.
Thank you very much, both of you. Thank you, gentlemen. Mr. Buckley. Professor Galbraith, you want to start?
Be happy to. Mr. Buckley, do you favor a system of vouchers for
Yes,
public
I do.
schools?
For anything, right?
You do.
Roughly speaking, yeah.
Why then is this not also on the agenda for your team this evening?
You just placed it there. and
I have, indeed.
I'll run with it.
Good.
What would you like me to do? Do an ode to vouchers?
Well, let me ask you this. Are you familiar with the T.J. Rusk Middle School here in Dallas?
Sorry?
Are you familiar with the T.J. Rusk Middle School here in Dallas?
In Dallas? No.
I drove by it on the way in from the airport. It's a nice school. It has a lovely brick building, and it had
Well, tell me about it,
16 temporary classrooms. Would you favor or oppose the expenditure of public funds to replace those crowded, ill-heated temporary classrooms with
Like
another
the,
good, solid brick school building?
Let me give you some background. The situation in Texas is unique because between 1995 and the year 2000, they'll have an increase of 1.5 million people.
I'm just
This
asking
is far
whether
in
you favor
advance
the
of,
expenditure of funds
under
to
the
build school
circumstances, they
buildings.
have to make provisions to suggest that they can simply exfoliate classrooms for 1.5 million is naive. You wouldn't want to do that, would you?
Now, I'm not arguing with the judgment of putting up the temporary classrooms. I'm asking whether you wouldn't think that a building
Do I prefer
which kept
permanent to
people
temporary
out of the ring,
classrooms? Yes, I do.
and you would prefer paying for them.
Well, unless we have a little slave labor.
Excellent. And so you would concede that this is a public function, which would improve the quality of public education right here in Dallas.
Look, Mr. Galbraith,
These are very simple questions,
The
Mr. Buckley.
notion that dismantling the welfare state means to dismantle education or health or Social Security is simply naive. We're suggesting better ways to approach the problem.
No. The resolution says that you are in favor of abolishing the welfare state. I can only take you at your own word, but I'll yield the floor to my colleagues.
The welfare state is the term we used to describe the existing system. We are prepared to say that in almost every situation that can be improved by an infusion of the moral energy of people acting for themselves.
What do you understand to be the meaning of the word abolish, Mr. Buckley?
Replace it.
Improvement. Is abolishing?
No. Abolish it and come in with something else.
Professor Tyson.
Like, if you abolish poverty, you come in with non-poverty.
What a good idea.
Why don't you go?
Would you say there was a fair amount of poverty in the 19th century?
Oh, a lot of it.
Well, how could all this poverty exist in the 19th century before there was a welfare state?
Let me give some handy figures. Stick this in your next book. In the year 1900, 90% of the American people were poor by current poverty levels. That reduced to about 11 to 12% along around 1974-5. It has not then moved very hard. It's oscillated a little bit. The questions we wonder is, how come that graph, which rose like this, from 90 to 11, 12, why is it stalled? The answer is the welfare state.
No, don't you think that the widening maldistribution of income has something to do with the market economy?
The notion that the difference in income levels between the wealthy and the poor is something to fret about is an entirely incomplete perception. What we should fret about is any impediments on the ascendancy of the poor. This is what happened during those 75 years that I speak of. The poor became ex-poor. Now, to the extent that there's sclerosis built into the situation, which is because of high taxes, that ascendancy isn't as heartening as it once was.
Well, isn't it a fact that the most successful period of economic growth in the United States was a period when the top income tax rate was 91%, the period of the post-war boom?
Well, it's certainly true that after the Second World War, and Mr. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson were very correct in saying that, there was a repression of pent-up energy, and that high tax was getting in the way of it. As you know, the average rise during those years was between 3.8 and 4.2. It has slowed down a little bit since then, and I think it would go back more quickly if some of those heavy overloads were mitigated.
Well, are top marginal rates higher now than they were then, or lower now than they were then?
They're lower.
So,
no thanks to you.
Well,
On that lovely note, thank you very much, Mr. Buckley. The captain of the opposition team will now accept questions from the proponents. Dr. Goodman.
Jamie, your team seems confused about how it could be that so much money could be spent on means-tested welfare programs, and yet we have so much poverty as a result. Are you aware that an enormous amount of money under the food stamp program and other welfare programs does not go to poor people?
The food stamp program was one of the most highly effective programs at providing a basic level of support, not only for food but for other purposes, for people who would otherwise be poor in this country. It's a very, very effective and very well administered program.
So yes or no?
I don't agree with the premise of your question, because it isn't an accurate premise, John, and you know it isn't an accurate premise.
Well, would you believe a Census Bureau statement that says 46% of all poor families get no means-tested benefit of any kind?
That is not the same statement as the one you were just making. It's not even closely related to it.
Would you believe a Census Bureau statement that 40% of families that do receive a means-tested benefit from the government aren't poor?
Let's go back to the one before. And if you are telling me that over the course of, in particular the 1980s, when fairly radical cuts were made in quite a number of programs, a great many people who would otherwise receive government assistance were cut off from that, and if you're telling me that, among other things, one of the reasons why the homeless problem became as serious as it did was because of the cuts in public housing programs in the early 1980s, then I would say that's a reasonable proposition.
Before you get away with that, can you name me one program at the end of the 1980s that had less dollars in it than at the beginning of the 1980s?
In real terms, a great many did. Of course. Of course.
Only the defense?
No, of course. In real terms, a great many did. You're just making an accounting confusion by not taking out the effect of inflation.
No, only the Defense Department, I think, falls in that category. But I want to come back,
Public housing was cut
but I want to come back to John's question. That the Census Bureau conclusion, and he got off in another area, but the Census Bureau found that 23% of food stamps go to people who are not poor. Now, that may be a good thing. I mean, it's helping those people, but that is not exactly a program that's well designed.
Your team is caught on the horns of a philosophical dilemma that you would prefer that all programs that are intended to alleviate program poverty fail, and therefore only go to people who remain poor after the effect of those programs. I really disagree with that. It seems to me the purpose of the Social Security program, for example, is not to alleviate, but to prevent poverty amongst the elderly, to take people who have been working non-poor for their entire lives and to provide them with a basic retirement income that prevents them from lapsing into poverty until the day they die. And that, it seems to me, is a great American objective. And one of the most extraordinary things that we've accomplished in this country in the last 30 years has been to reduce the rate of poverty amongst the elderly so that it is less than that of the general population. That's something actually which was a great action of the Nixon administration in the early 1970s, raising the benefit rates in Social Security, led to that result, and it seems to me it's something about which we can all be rightly proud. It's a triumph of the welfare state, as your side describes.
Absolutely, but the Social Security system, as I said earlier, is not designed as a poverty program.
The Social Security system was invented at a time when a great many elderly had no alternative but the most grinding poverty. And very few of them are poor now in comparative terms. And if I asked you, well, gee, if you want to abolish the Social Security system, I really suggest you get the opinion of the newly elected governor of Florida, because
I have never.
it would really do
don't
him
know.
the population of his state.
You all are at the wrong debate here. I don't think anybody here is in favor of abolishing the Social Security system.
Dr. Keyes is sort of shaking his head.
No, I haven't said that. But I would want to ask a question, because we always talk about these terms poverty and improvement and all, like you all actually measure these things in a way that includes all the necessary criteria, and I wonder if you do. For instance, just as a question, is a child being raised today by a single mother to whom he was born as an illegitimate child, who on account of various and assorted government help and maintenance payments manages to rise above the poverty level, better or worse off than a child who was raised 3 decades ago in a 2-parent family where the family and its aggregate income fell below the poverty line? Do you think a young man raised in that situation is better or worse off because of the absence of a father driven from the home by the ill effects of the welfare system?
Well, you touch on a personal note, Mr. Keyes. I have been a single parent, and I don't think that this is a problem which is tightly related to poverty, per se. It is obviously dreadful when a woman loses, or a member of a household loses the income that a family brought, but it seems to me that's precisely the sort of thing for which a program of cash and income assistance is designed to remedy that problem.
So
It's
then
not a problem which goes on forever.
I'm sorry. Thank you, Professor Galbraith. I call on the Bank of America and Better Living Through Chemistry. And Better Living Through Chemistry will start the questioning.
Well, Ms. Tyson, maybe I can get us back from capital gang to focused discussion here. What's wrong with the idea of saying to an individual, we will give you a tax credit for money that you give to poverty programs, and we'll reduce the budget of the federal government for poverty programs so that money can go to the Salvation Armies, the Habitats, the Red Crosses, the alcoholism treatment centers of towns across the country? What's wrong with that idea?
I would say there are 2 questions I would have about that idea. Number one, all of this debate is premised on an assumption which you and apparently most of the audience believe, but which is not documented in fact, and that is that private anti-poverty programs work better than public anti-poverty programs. Let me take the example of medicine here, because that's the example that I know most about. The government programs in healthcare, and this may surprise you and the audience to find out, on a cost per capita basis, have outperformed the private sector for the last 30 years.
Is that true? Is that true of VA hospitals?
If you look at Medicare
Hey, I'm asking the question.
person,
Your turn comes
no,
in a second.
VA hospitals happen to be actually quite cost competitive in terms of prices they pay per unit of service. They deliver a lot of services because we as a society have decided to provide full-time health care from until death for anyone who served in the armed forces. Maybe you would like to get rid of that.
You are arguing.
But for the services that are provided, the VA is cost effective. What I am saying is just look at the service, look at the number of people who are provided the service by the government, say Medicare, Medicaid, veterans, I don't care which, and you compare the cost of that service and the number of people served. Government programs do better than private programs in health care.
I think that's not true.
It is true. It is absolutely true.
But answer me, if that were true, why are 94% of the homeless shelters in America private as opposed to government?
Because we have not put enough money into the shelter of the homeless. That is why. We do not have enough public money. We have plenty of homeless people. As it was already pointed out by my side, we have had a decline in real dollars spent on this population as it has been rising as a share of the population. Other societies do not have it.
So the private sector is doing the job that the government should be doing in this case.
The private sector is doing the job because the voters have decided the government should not.
Very good. Very good. We
And what I'm saying,
have
Mr.
established, you're
No, no,
not,
What
your
I'm saying,
questions
Mr.
come
DuPont-
on your time, not my
Okay.
time.
All right.
We have just
decide.
established that the private sector is doing things.
In one area, you
yes,
established that. And you
agreed,
did not
agreed,
establish,
yeah.
by the way, that the private sector is doing it more cost-effectively than the public sector would have. And that is what I was talking about in
Well,
health.
I don't know
Because
the
I
answer
know
to that,
30 years of
because
experience
I
in
haven't
health.
looked at the 6% of the homeless shelters that are run by the government to know whether they're more cost-effective.
So you...
But the private charities in this country, I think, in contrary to your statement, are doing a much better job.
Give
than
me
the
some
government.
evidence. I gave you evidence on health. I gave you evidence. I want some evidence.
23% of the food stamps go to people who are not poor, according to the
I
Census
don't know
Bureau.
what percentage of food in soup kitchens go to people who just walk in. I don't know. You have to give me a comparative statistic.
I gave you
No,
a
you
statistic.
didn't. You gave me something wrong with the
35%
federal
of
program. Sorry.
Medicaid recipients are not poor. The federal government is a
Yes, you know who the 35%...
It's a shotgun.
Excuse me. Now, the
private
Medicaid...
sector.
Medicaid is very important here, folks, because that's one of the reasons their numbers are misleading. Very important. Medicaid, which they're counting totally as expenditures on the poor, most Medicaid dollars, the overwhelming majority of Medicaid dollars, go to the elderly for long-term care. There are people in this room who have family income that they are not spending on the long-term care of their parents so that their parents can take Medicaid. So it's not about poverty at all. Medicaid is about poverty, 15 million children, but it is also about the elderly middle class. So are you against that?
That's a good thing, but if
Aha,
you just...
okay, as
but
long as you're not poor, you can get the
I'm
money.
not arguing against Medicaid.
Mm-hmm.
I'm arguing that if you want to target benefits and resources on people who are poor, you're far better to do it with a charity in your community than to do it out of Washington,
And all I'm saying
where
is
it missed target.
all I'm saying is your number is very misleading because
The Census
Medicaid
Department,
does
the
not.
government number couldn't be misleading.
Sorry, Medicaid is not Medicaid. I'm sure the audience is well aware that you can use statistics however you want. And you can use words up here however you want. You
Even
can
the
call
government
charity
can use
slavery.
statistics that way. I'm amazed. Your turn to question.
My question,
Michael Kinley should have said that, but
She was already doing
he's
it.
dozing, so...
I'm not dozing, believe me. Who could doze with this racket?
I guess my question would be, the premise of your arguments is that you look at two things that have happened and then you draw a conclusion. You look at spending on poverty programs in the United States in absolute dollars, not real dollars. In absolute dollars, they've gone up, in real dollars, they've gone down. But you look at that, and you look at the poverty rate, and you say, gee, the poverty rate hasn't gone down, the dollars have gone up, the programs aren't working, let's do it through the private sector, without ever giving me a piece of evidence that the private sector does it better or could do it. Now, let me give you another fact. Let's look a little bit outside of the United States for a minute. Well, all right, then, the question is, how do you explain the fact that in the rest of the advanced industrial world, in Europe, and this even goes for England, that we have seen these more generous, considerably more generous anti-poverty programs over the last 25 years, and a declining poverty rate, or certainly not a rising poverty rate. See, it doesn't make sense. You're basically saying we caused the poverty rate to rise in the United States.
You're arguing that the European economies are better off than the American
On
economies?
poverty rates, they are.
On
poverty rates,
on economies
we
as
are
a whole,
talking
we are
poverty
way
rates.
ahead of them.
Well, you know what I'd say to that,
Compare
Pete?
the unemployment rate.
Pete, how could we be so far ahead of them, which I think we are, by the way,
Yeah.
with such a lousy set of government programs? My God. If we are
Because the
doing
government
so well,
programs
Pete,
are
it's
such a
partly
smaller
because...
portion of our
No,
society
no.
than they are in Europe is the answer to that question.
No. Well, I'm sure many people here agree with that.
That's true.
But there's absolutely not a bit of economic evidence to support that. Not a single bit.
Not a single bit of evidence that the
That the
welfare
size-
state in America is smaller than the welfare
No,
state
not
in
a
Europe?
single bit
That's
of
the point I
evidence
made.
to indicate there's any positive correlation between tax as a share of GDP or government spending as a share of GDP and an economy's growth rate. No evidence
Oh,
whatsoever.
I will be
I'm
back to you in
sorry.
another debate on that
I'm sorry,
one.
that is absolutely the case.
Questions?
Questions? What would you like to see done with the, let's assume that all of the elderly on Medicaid and all of the children on Medicaid are poor. All the children are, all the elderly are not, but let's assume for the sake of argument they're all poor. Suppose we went to your system. This is a lot of money. This is big dollars. This is $40 billion. Okay. Suppose we didn't get $40 billion. What happens if an elderly person or a sick child falls in front of your doorstep? What do we do?
No, you misunderstand the equation. The $40 billion would still be there. It's just that a quarter of it or a third of it or a half of it would come directly from the private sector.
Oh,
The
okay.
same amount
now,
of money
we,
would be there.
we have a problem here because if we give a tax incentive to the private sector to do this, the government may actually end up being a little short of funds. So do you want the government to run? The government's going to have to hold its $40 billion.
No,
Get
same,
ready.
Same amount of money.
No, I'm afraid not. The tax incentive costs money.
Same amount
the
of
tax
money.
incentive takes money
We
away.
got another problem here. We got to move on.
Okay.
Thank you both. Dr. Goodman. Mr. Kuttner.
Clarify something for us. You seem to be arguing two contradictory propositions. On the one hand, you're saying that the $368 billion that goes to the poor is not alleviating poverty, but you're also arguing that it's a scandal that some of it is going to the near poor. So by definition, if you're keeping somebody out of poverty with food stamp outlays or making it that they're not medically indigent by giving them Medicaid, they're not poor. Is that a loss or a gain?
Okay, let me make this clear. The Congressional Research Service, this is an agency of the Congress, has calculated that we're spending $368 billion a year on means-tested benefits, which means these are anti-poverty
They don't all go to the poor.
So if you like, the voters, the Congress approved these programs thinking perhaps that the money was going to help poor people.
Some of it's going to
In fact, some of it does go to poor people, but a lot of it doesn't go to poor people. And what we have is not a real safety net at all. The Census Bureau even said that almost half of all poor families aren't getting any means-tested benefit, which means they're not getting any benefit in any given year from any of these programs.
What I'm trying to understand is whether you are confusing the fact that some means-tested money, in fact, goes to the near poor, because that is the design of the program.
Of course it does, but what I can't understand is why your side wouldn't favor our proposition, and that is allowing people to direct all of this money to the neediest people. Right now, it doesn't go to the neediest people. I think, despite what you all have said, that it's self-evident that the private sector is the real safety net in this country. It is where people turn when they are first in need. It takes a long time to get on these means-tested programs, but when you have a crisis, when you have an emergency, if you're hungry, you need a place to stay, it's to the private sector that people turn in every city in this country. And I'm saying, why don't we take this real safety net that we have, put more money into it, and take it away from these government programs, which only occasionally help poor people and not reliable.
Professor Galbraith.
Mr. Goodman, if one took away, as I take it you favor, doing the support of Medicaid for the care of the long-term care of the elderly, non-poor, who would pay those bills?
Okay, I'm not for taking it away. What I'm for doing, what I'm
Wait,
in favor of doing.
Medicaid is a piece of the welfare state,
Yes,
is it
so
not?
what I'm in favor
and
of.
your side is
what I'm in
arguing
favor
for the
of doing
proposition that
is
the welfare state
allowing
should be abolished. is it
taxpayers
not?
to make different decisions on how that money is spent.
And what if
Now, they may
Okay,
make
okay,
exactly
so what
the
you're
same.
saying is that Medicaid
Well,
would
if you
not-
get to ask this question, I get to answer it. The taxpayer may decide that he wants to continue spending money on those nursing homes.
Wait a minute.
But I'm telling you,
who's
most
the-
people I know that know anything about nursing
Goodman,
home
do you
care
favor the rule
know
of
that
law?
the amount of money that's being spent there probably could be far more efficiently spent on home care and in different ways.
Do you favor the rule of law? Do you favor the rule of law?
Yes.
Do you favor representative democracy?
Yes.
And when a representative democracy duly constituted passes a law which says that there is a program called Medicaid, which assumes the responsibility for paying some of the bills for the care of the elderly, is that per se immoral in your view?
No, but what
Thank
I
you.
think...
You disagree with Mr. Keyes on that,
I'm not through here. What I do believe is that we're perfectly free and should advance better ways of doing these things. And I believe that if the proposals made on this side of the table were adopted, it would be a hell of a lot better for poor people than what you guys are defending.
And what if the individuals in this country, in their wisdom, in the ways that they allocated charity, did not allocate enough charity to provide enough beds for old people in nursing homes or enough vaccinations for kids? Wouldn't the government have to step in?
I've explained this before. I would phase this
You have
in.
not
I would
explained.
allow people to allocate 5% of their welfare tax dollars to private charities. Then I would go to 10. Then I would go to 15. Let's see how it works. But what we do know is this. When people make the decisions, they're very smart and very rational. They support the programs that really do help poor people, and they don't dump their money into these entitlements programs, which may or may not help poor people.
John, in all respect, I'm not sure that you're actually picturing the programs you're talking about. You seem to be picturing institutions.
We have to move on.
Oh, no.
Sorry. Thanks, Dr. Goodman.
That was lucky for him, wasn't it?
With all due respect. Mr. Kuttner.
Mr. Kuttner, I will try again in some form or another to get a straightforward answer to a different
I hope you'll
version
leave
of
me
the
time.
same question. Because we talk about poverty as if the measure of poverty is material possessions. Is somebody living in a neighborhood today where the culture of poverty is characterized by single-parent households, violence among the young, skyrocketing illegitimacy, absent father families, et cetera, but where the families have access to all of these welfare programs that sort of keep them somewhat above the poverty level. Would you say they are better or worse off than families that lived below the monetary poverty level in neighborhoods such as my parents grew up in, where they were poor, but where they lived in households where there were two parents, where children didn't kill each other on the street, where people respected sexual morality and obligation? Are we, in fact, speaking the right language, or have we merely substituted one depraved form of poverty for a material form of poverty?
I would obviously prefer intact families where breadwinners are paid decent wages and their kids live in decent houses and go to good schools on safe streets. I don't think your side has proved that poverty was caused by the welfare state, because there was dire poverty in the world long before there was a welfare state.
One follow-up. I do think, though, do you think it would be fair to say, though, that our experience over the last 30 years or so has proved that your welfare state approach does not produce intact families above the poverty level, but instead aggravates the problem of broken families?
I think aid to education, Social Security, child care programs, Medicaid programs, Medicare programs have been good programs. I think aid to families with dependent children was a badly flawed program. I think everybody at this table, all 8 of us, would agree with that.
I don't think this side is arguing, Bob, that these programs caused poverty.
Well, Alan is.
What this side is arguing is that there are better ways to alleviate poverty, and that we see them in our communities, that Washington, in spite of what Laura says, really is not very cost-effective at alleviating poverty because it paints with such a broad brush.
Yeah, I think there's a place for the Salvation Army and the Red Cross. There's also a place for the food stamp program and the Medicaid program. I think the sleight of hand that your side is engaged in is the assumption that somehow by having individuals take tax credits and make charitable donations to private sector institutions, somehow that will get all the money that's needed to old people in nursing homes, to poor kids' vaccinations. And what if it doesn't come out right? You seem to be saying the government would be holding the bag anyway. That's what John seems to be saying.
That's correct, because the amount of money...
the government would be holding the bag.
The amount of money is fixed. Say there's $100 million being spent on some program today, whatever the program is.
Yeah, but you're giving all of that to people to deduct from their income tax. You can't spend the same $100 billion twice.
But when $20 million of that is contributed to the local charity and deducted from the income tax, the federal budget goes down to $80 million.
Right.
Right. But what you've done is you've strengthened charitable efforts in a community where you know the people, You know which organizations are good and bad, and you can see the result, and you'll get a better result in helping poor people.
Well, you've diverted money from one strategy of preventing poverty to another strategy of
Okay, let me
preventing.
just ask you
You
about-
can't spend the same money twice.
Let me just ask you about bang for the buck, because Laura Tyson,
Yes.
and now apparently you are questioning this. In any city in the country, aren't you getting more for the dollar you give to the Salvation Army or the local soup kitchen than you get from the food stamp program or the AFDC program or any other entitlement
I think if you
program?
took a vote among poor people and asked them, would you rather have $100 worth of food stamps to spend as you like at your supermarket, just like any middle-class person, or would you rather be given a chit to stand in line at a soup kitchen? They'd take the food stamps, and so would you, and so would I.
I'm not asking what the recipients, remember, a lot of those recipients aren't poor. I'm saying from the giver's point of view, someone who wants to help relieve poverty, which gives the biggest bang for the buck?
I think Medicaid gives a bigger bang for the buck than waiting for charity.
Then a clinic that's privately supported giving out free care?
You just ventured off your Soviet model here.
What model?
Let me ask you a question.
Governor,
Isn't the food stamp
Governor,
a voucher program?
Governor, thank you very much.
Thank you.
The team captains, Mr. Buckley and Professor Galbraith. And Mr. Buckley will start.
Mr. Galbraith, there have been references here and there throughout the course of the evening to things like slavery, coercion, and we've heard from you and your associates that what we are engaged in right now is simply nothing more than standard practices in representative democracy. Now, I tend to react, let me ask you if you do also, against a society in which A meets with B to decide how much C will give to D. Do you get my point?
No.
Okay. Well, my point was nicely...
I messed up in the sequence in the alphabet.
Excuse me?
You were pursuing it.
Sorry?
Your alphabetic sequence was just too much for me, Bill.
Well, a situation in which... let me back up and say
Or was it
the
algebra?
protections of the minority are enshrined in the Bill of Rights, are they not? We all know that. Now, ought there to be any protections for people who exercise minority rights that are economic? Mr. Hayek, in his book, The Constitution of Liberty, says that the progressive income tax is the greatest potential enemy of self-government. You don't agree with that, obviously, right?
I had a colleague until last year at the University of Texas, a great woman, Barbara Jordan, who burst onto the stage 25 years ago by saying, "My faith in the Constitution is complete. It is whole. It is total."
Well,
And the Constitution of the United States is a document which permits even income taxation, much as you may not like it.
no,
it permits,
it doesn't. The
it
Constitution
permits the
had to be
creation-
amended to have a progressive income tax.
The Constitution,
in
as it
1913.
stands, permits an income tax with that
As
amendment.
it stands. Well, if it was perfect, why'd you have need to fuss with it in 1916?
The Constitution has periodically been amended. It is still the Constitution,
The
and
point
it
is
was
you're-
the Constitution when Barbara spoke those words in 1975. We have an income tax which is tested under the Constitution that we have. We have a Social Security system
Yes,
that is
but
tested under the Constitution.
that's
we have.
right. We've
we
had a
have Medicare and
Constitution
Medicaid. We have these
with-
programs.
look,
If you thought they were unconstitutional,
We've had
by all means,
26
take it to
amendments to the
court.
Constitution.
But let's not
so
argue about whether
obviously
they're
it was
constitutional
malleable.
or not. They clearly
Now, wait a minute,
are.
wait a minute. Are you saying that the Constitution under no circumstances should ever be changed because it's perfect right now? When did you find out it was
I
perfect?
see. So you're in favor of amending the Constitution to make the income tax unconstitutional
I'm
again?
trying to get you to focus
No,
on one thing,
likewise.
which is that when A meets with B to decide how much C should get B, you don't really have representative government. You have him voting, consulting with him and her.
Look, I'm
and
prepared even
him
to accept the fact
to
that the
decide how
Republicans
much
are a
we should
majority in the
contribute to your
Congress. It's still the
projects.
Congress. When it
Now,
passes a law, that's the
The
law.
weakness is the progressive feature of the income tax. If it weren't for that, then anything that you come up with would be also self-imposed. But it isn't. 95% of the American people, 50% of the American people pay 95% of the taxes. Now, is it your proposal that they should pay 100% tax? Or what is it that what barrier is there, if any, to the trampling of the rights of the property owner by what you call representative
Let me answer that
Democrats.
question in a serious and sober way. The market economy only exists in a framework given by our laws. The attempt to establish a market economy in countries which do not have well-established systems of law has been a dreadful disaster.
There's a certain overhead, you're correct.
There is a certain overhead. And that overhead includes certain limits on market outcomes. People cannot be too poor, and to a certain degree, if they do well, they have to pay a tax on their gain. That's a perfectly reasonable system, and most Americans accept it. We've lived with it.
That's improvisation of yours. That wasn't Adam Smith. Adam Smith said we need to have overhead in government in order to take care of firefighting and the administration of justice and national monuments.
All right, you may now ask questions.
I yield to no one in my admiration for Adam Smith. Mr. Buckley, you are a skier.
A what?
A skier.
A what?
A skier.
It's not a trick question.
Downhill, alpine, that kind of deal.
You've been known to ski.
Oh, sure.
And you have skied, I believe, with Milton Friedman.
And with you.
And therefore, I take it you are familiar with Milton's ideas, since, as we both know, when he skis, as in all other activities, he speaks of nothing else.
No, he speaks about everything.
I want to take up one of his ideas with you for a second, the idea of a natural rate of unemployment. This is, as you know, Milton Friedman's idea that even in a well-run free market economy, fully at liberty of contract, and with a minimal government, there would still be a substantial rate of unemployment.
Yeah, when I went to school, they called it frictional unemployment.
Well,
when somebody quits a job because I'm answering your question.
Since he's your friend.
When somebody quits his job hoping to get another one, he becomes unemployed. He becomes a statistic. Approximately 3-4. Harry Truman thought 3%, and at that time, some of his counselors thought 5%, but it's in that range.
Okay, so my question is, how do you propose to ensure that those who are unemployed eat?
Well, to begin with, they have an appetite. So that takes care of half the problem.
That takes care of the demand for food, but not of the supply.
There is no record of starvation in America before 1965. So the notion that America was indifferent to people to the point of permitting them to starve is simply schlock liberalism, a surrealistic reading of conservative order.
Well, I happen to be old enough to recall that Robert Kennedy took a tour through Appalachia in the South in 1964 or 1965, and he encountered plenty of evidence that people were under.
The trouble, Norman Thomas once said to me, there are 10 million people in America who don't earn a living wage. I said, well, why aren't they dead? Now, you have to answer questions of that kind of character. Yeah. He took a tour in Appalachia to see people who were in want, but not people who were starving.
But you approve of the want. That's the difference between you and me. No. You approve of it, and I do not.
No. I say if there's going to be any economic movement at any time, there are going to be discolorations. For a while, people making wagons are going to be looking for a job, but meanwhile, they'll end up in Detroit. So that's the price that one pays for evolution in a free marketplace.
That is the most perfectly clear expression of your point of view that I could possibly hope for. Thank you very much.
You want to retire on that note?
I'll retire on that
Thank you very much.
Am I still on?
Only if you insist.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Mr. Curry. Mr. Curry, it's your turn to submit to questioning from the proponents. Oh, sorry. All right, Mr. Keyes. Mr. Curry, you can start the questioning if you'd like.
Well, just one point of information, Mr. Keyes. When asked earlier whether or not you supported the abolition of the Social Security system, you said you hadn't taken a position on that. Do you?
No, I didn't say I hadn't taken a position. I said that I hadn't taken a position that supported the abolition of the Social Security system. I do believe that if we understand the system properly, then we should be looking to make it into what it is supposed to be. A true investment system that allows people to put money aside so that they will have things available for retirement, presumably at the best rate of return, which rate of return probably isn't when you let the government be the middleman determining how that money is to be invested. So it obviously needs some fundamental reform that will put control of those invested dollars back in the hands of the people themselves who are to benefit from them, rather in the hands of politicians who have used the money to mask the deficit instead of investing it the way they're supposed to.
Help me one last time, though, Mr. Keyes. When the Social Security system was initiated, the substantial majority of the American elderly lived in poverty. Old age in America was almost inevitably a gradual slippage into poverty and indignity. And not as a savings program, but as a generational transfer program, there are those who would say, in fact, of Social Security, that it is the greatest accomplishment of government in the second half of this century. I'm almost done.
You're almost done with your question, yeah.
That it has lifted the elderly out of poverty. That it is now no more likely that you'll be poor if you're old than if you're middle-aged or young.
Okay.
But since it was all for the poor, help me with the moral distinction you make. Someone might think you're just making a political distinction of not going after something controversial and simply beating up on the poor. What is it that makes this less slavery?
I know that.
What is it that makes this less slavery and less about charity?
I realize that all the things that were said about these programs were probably lies. And so when they said that it wasn't a welfare program, that it was a social insurance program intended to help people invest for their retirement years, that probably was a lie, and you guys intended all along just to have a socialist program to transfer income. But all I am saying is I support the concept. Let me finish. I support the concept as it was originally articulated, not as it was perverted by folks like yourself, apparently, into a welfare program that it's not, or into a welfare program that it's not, a transfer program that it's not supposed to be. But let me question a premise. Yes.
No.
I mean, he takes 5 minutes to ask his question, and I don't get 3 minutes to make my answer.
Mr. Curry, I think you've both gotten equal amounts of excessive time. Ms. Tyson.
I have a question which is a little different. In your statement about the breakup of the family, very eloquent statement, you basically argued that the welfare programs were a major reason for the breakup of the American family. I have two things I'd like you to explain then. Number one, the increase in illegitimacy and the increase in single-parent households has occurred in the United States across all income groups. Most income groups have not benefited from the welfare program, so how do you explain that? And number two, let's look again outside the United States, in countries which have much more generous child support programs, parental support programs, Medicare, medical choice programs for children. There has not been the breakdown of the family that we've observed in the lower class in America. So how can you explain those two other phenomena?
Well, two things. First, I think you practice in the asking of the question the same fallacy that was being practiced a minute ago when we talked about poverty among the aged. When I was growing up, for instance, I used to visit my aunt and uncle in New York City. Living in their apartment on Grand Avenue at the time, we had a very elderly aunt of mine who was living in their apartment, living with the family, and so forth and so on. However, given her status as an individual, the government regarded her as a poor person. She was, in fact, living in the home and being supported by the people who were going out to work. She was part of the family. The government counted her as poor, though, and I'm sure that would have counted her as poor in the statistics that they amassed, but the family was, in fact, taking care of that person. That person's existence, my aunt's existence, was then used as an excuse by liberals to say, nobody's taking care of her. But that was a lie. The family system, in fact, did take care of a lot of the elderly, even though the government, in the way it kept its statistics, refused to recognize and acknowledge that fact.
It's a nice story. It simply does not answer either of my questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Keyes. Now, Mr. Curry. And Mr. Goodman.
Bill, earlier you indicated that you found the idea offensive that poverty could be behavioral, but studies show if you just...
Excuse me, I think I found it offensive that Mr. Keyes suggested I was without a God for disagreeing with him, but no, poverty is in part behavioral, sure.
Studies show that if you just do three things, graduate from high school, get married, and get a job, you do all three of those things, it's almost impossible to stay poor for very long. And if you don't do any of those three things, you have a very high probability of being poor. Doesn't that suggest to you that a lot of poverty
Get a
is
job
behavioral?
was the third one?
Yes.
Yeah, that's kind of a tautology, isn't it, though, John?
How's that?
If you get a job, you're not poor, and if you don't get a job, you are. I mean, where'd you get this, boy's life? I mean, you know, come on. Yes, if you do those three things, I agree. If you graduate from school,
We are
you
living
get
in full
married, and you get
employment.
a job, you probably won't be poor.
We are living in
Although
full
the number
employment
of working
economy,
poor,
aren't we?
if you'd like to go to that question, the number of people who go out and work every day, 40 hours, at jobs that you and I would turn up our noses at, I'm pretty certain, and who are still poor, and who depend upon a few food stamps or a public housing subsidy, or a little something just so they can have the kind of life that we think has elemental dignity. That's a fairly large number in this country, and that's because we have this social contract. The difference, if I may, the difference, I think, you guys all believe that markets and trade and technology create broad-based wealth, that left to their own devices, that will happen. I say to you that the record of history is the opposite. Markets, trade, technology, entrepreneurship creates wealth. It gives us the Vanderbilts and the Gateses and the DuPonts.
Let me ask you something.
But it doesn't give us a middle class. And the middle class, and the middle class.
What about automobile?
No. Kids, jeez, what an unruly crowd.
What about automobile?
Ed, let me just finish.
Let me ask you,
People,
how
I think
much
it goes to the heart of
think
this.
Someone who is a nanny in Dallas, Texas can earn right here in this city.
I don't know. What
Dallas News
nannies are
tells
earning.
me the average
I wish
pay
I'd seen that
$400 a week. That's $20,000 a year just for being a nanny. Now, isn't that something?
No, I think that's
relatively
fine.
easy to do?
But the point is that the market will give you wealth.
For that, Dr. Goodman.
But in fact, even within this audience, there are scores of people whom I know have clapped for you all night, who got a hand up in the GI Bill, who got federally insured student loans to go through school, who went through public schools and colleges and graduate schools, who've all been a part of a collective decision we've made to create a system that enables us to reach our full potential as human beings.
Now-
You might even have benefited from that, perhaps on a couple of corporate tax
Bill,
breaks.
let me focus in here, because you just said something, and I want to come back to something that was lost in the end of Bob Kuttner's comment. The GI Bill is a voucher system, and it's a good thing, you just said. The food stamp program is a voucher thing, and it's a good thing. So why can't we have vouchers for public education?
Let me say, Pete, you and I have had this discussion before, I believe, but let me just say this. Those are all tough questions, and there are voucher programs that work, and there are arguments on both sides of this. I resort to invoking Thomas Jefferson, who said of the common school, the public school, that it was the principal instrument through which we make good on the promise of the Constitution of opportunity under law.
What if it's not?
And that is, and in fact, I would
it's a
say to
rotten
you, John,
school?
and well, I would say to you, John, if we're going to do education, I mean, just quickly, if you show me a school system in which all the parents are in the top 1% of income, I'll show you a bunch of kids on their way to Harvard. If you show me a school system where all the parents are in the bottom 1% of income, I'll show you kids, most of whom are on their way to jail.
You
I'll
said
show
that
you
in the
a school
social-
system-
a
I'll show
public
you
school-
a school system
You
that has a
said that
monopoly.
last-
Just
Trap
statistically
children.
speaking,
They don't have an alternative.
Statistically speaking, that's the way it's worked in this country. That's a true statistical observation.
That is, it is not true that,
Excuse me.
wait, it is not true that
Excuse me, you have a
low-income people
better-
are criminals.
No, it's not.
That's just what
all
you
corporate.
said.
I
The
said-
lowest 1% go to jail.
Where in fact, you're in the bottom income percentile in this country, yeah, about half go to jail. About half.
Poor people
Oh,
don't-
sure. Yeah, well,
don't
excuse me, if
generically
you don't
go
know
to
that, you
jail.
should read up on it. But my point is that a public look, let's not hate each other here, guys. Jeez.
That's a great note on which to end.
My point here is that a public school classroom is a window through which we see problems that arise in other places. There are other social problems that matter.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Curry. And it's time for closing arguments. Professor Galbraith will deliver the closing argument for the opposition.
The
The resolution before us is that the welfare state should be abolished. We had some difficulty getting the other side to recognize the distinction between the welfare state and state welfare, but we got over that. We never quite got over the little difficulty that we had with the meaning of the word abolish. Bill Buckley, when pressed for a close synonym, came up with improve, and I am sure glad he was not around in 1865. But having collapsed the debate onto our side, the challenge of how to improve the welfare state, the core programs of Social Security, of Medicare and Medicaid, public education, how to preserve full employment, how to maintain labor and wage standards, is indeed with us still. And when you ask our friends on the radical side for their position, it turns out that they're against every one of those programs in one form or another. They have already, of course, abolished child welfare. They would undermine the public schools. They would not build the new school buildings that we need, but they would rather give parents with enough extra income to pay for private tuition a couple of $1,000s or so to buy a ticket out. They would turn the nursing home cases over to charity, and they would turn the Social Security fund over to stockbrokers and fund managers who, no doubt, would like that very much. I regret to say that this position is not a fringe one. It is, in fact, the naked expression of very powerful political forces in this country. But what do we, on our side, offer in opposition? Just this: a clear view of the real successes of our mixed economy so far, a realistic appraisal of the problems that do exist, a willingness to work on them, and a faith not in the magic of markets, but in the good faith, goodwill, hard work, common values, and community spirit of the American people, and in the capacity of our democracy to tackle those problems.
Thank you, Professor. Mr. Buckley.
Mr. Chairman, we need a little discipline here. We got to understand what actually happens. What actually happens is that most Americans are paying their own way, but they do it via Washington. I did a study in a book which I published 20 years ago, and it turns out that approximately 92% of all the money that is spent in the 50 states is money that traveled from the state to Washington and on back to the original state, as I put it at the time, spending an expensive night out on the town. In the example of Rhode Island, then I remember it was $321 million to Washington, $321 million back. Now we're saying if this is going on, we're fooling ourselves about what we are engaged in, feeding this enormous bureaucracy in the high aspiration that we're doing more for more people. In fact, we have seen movements. It was under Mr. Clinton himself that we passed the repeal of the big of the huge law having to do with welfare, the welfare law. The administration of it was returned to the states, and the states are supplying their individual emphases, their individual passions or taboos, whatever, so that, for instance, in one state you will have more for education, another more for old people. We want to continue in that direction. The proposal is, if Mr. Clinton and the Congress were correct, in 1996, traveling from the federal government spends it all to the states, wouldn't we be better in taking a further step, moving on toward the community and towards individuals? We need a U2 plane now to try to trace where a doctor was born and when that dollar was ultimately deployed. So mystified is it by the bureaucracy that taxes here, pulls it into a pool and then doles it out. This is what we have walked into as a result of our infatuation with the welfare state, we repose our argument by insisting, Mr. Chairman, that there would be more human welfare and more enlightened human welfare if we dismantle that huge, ungovernable bureaucracy.
Thank you, Mr. Buckley. Well, there's been some talk tonight about the powers of coercion, and I have to say that as the equivalent of the government in this debate tonight, my powers of coercion were not very successful. I explicitly told these people that they should consider the welfare state in its multiple variations and not just in terms of helping the poor. Both sides ignored me about that. I explicitly said they should keep conscious of the difference between the question of what the government does using its coercive power, as Dr. Keyes points out, and how it does it in terms of vouchers. They ignored me about that. But as the proponents proved, ignoring the government is sometimes a good idea, because I think the result was a very spirited debate. And I'd like to thank both sides for a great job, and the audience here at the Hall of States in Dallas, and the producer Warren Steibel, and of course our audience at home. Thanks very much.
This program was a Warren Steibel production in association with South Carolina ETV. Funding for this firing line debate was made possible by a major grant from the Hatton W. Sumner's Foundation. Additional funding was provided by the Colcom Foundation and the John M. Olin Foundation. For a videocassette and transcript of this 2-hour debate, send $49.50 to Firing Line, 2700 Cypress Street, Columbia, South Carolina, 29205. State the subject of the debate and please allow 3 weeks for delivery. Transcripts without videocassettes are $10.
This is PBS.